It happened on one of those grey mornings that felt like the world was deliberately trying to drag a person down. The kind where the coffee tastes bitter, even with too much sugar, and every sound in the city echoes heavier than it should. Michael Reyes sat on a splintered wooden bench outside a bus stop in downtown Los Angeles, hands buried in his face, shoulders shaking. He wasn't crying quietly. No, this was the kind of crying a grown man tries to swallow, but his body refuses to hide. Cars rushed by, people walked fast, earbuds in, pretending not to see him, pretending not to hear the choked sound coming from a stranger who looked like the whole world had just collapsed around him. And in a way, it did. He had lost his job that morning, 30 minutes earlier. They gave him a single manila envelope and 30 seconds to clear out his desk. And now he was sitting there wondering how he'd tell his wife. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that someone was standing just a few feet behind him, listening, watching, waiting to decide whether to step in, and his name was Ozzy Osbourne. Michael didn't realize anyone had stopped near him until a voice cut through the noise of traffic like a note in a song that shouldn't exist in that moment. But before the voice came, there was another sound, the rustling of a grocery bag hitting pavement. Michael looked down and saw his last paycheck stub and termination paper slip from his shaking hands, fluttering on the ground like trash. A woman stepped around him, glanced down, then walked faster like she was afraid sorrow was contagious. It made the panic in his chest spread, made him remember the rent due in 9 days, the medical bills stacking for his daughter's inhaler, the blinking red light on the power meter. He grabbed the paper and tried to stand, but his knees buckled, and that's when the voice said, low and rough, "You all right, mate?" Michael froze. He didn't even turn around, because the voice sounded familiar. Too familiar. Impossible. Like a voice he had heard blasting through Walkmans and car stereos growing up. When he finally did turn, his eyes landed on a man with long dark hair streaked with grey, wearing black jeans and a faded blue hoodie, hands tucked casually in the pockets. His face lined and tired but unmistakable. Ozzy Osbourne stood there like fate had walked up from the sidewalk. Michael blinked like he was hallucinating, like grief had summoned a ghost, but Ozzy just nodded slowly, as if this was the most normal situation in the world. Michael tried to wipe his face with the back of his sleeve, embarrassed, shaking, unable to form words. Ozzy didn't rush him. He just lowered himself onto the bench like two broken men had decided to sit together for a minute on a random corner of Los Angeles. That part alone made Michael's chest ache even more because someone finally stopped. Someone finally noticed. Ozzy looked down at the ragged termination paper and the crumpled pay stub and simply said, "Life's a bloody circus sometimes." Michael didn't laugh. He couldn't. His voice cracked when he asked, "Why are you here?" But Ozzy didn't answer the question. Instead, he asked one of his own. "What's going wrong, really?" It shouldn't have been easy to answer a stranger, especially a stranger who happened to be a rock legend. But the words came pouring out like water through a broken dam. And Ozzy listened, really listened, until Michael said something that made him stop breathing for a second. Michael told him about the moment inside that office. The way his boss didn't even look him in the eye. How 15 years of work ended in less than a minute. But then he said the thing that truly broke him. "I promised my daughter I'd take her to her favorite diner on Saturday. I don't even know if I can afford pancakes." Ozzy's face softened, his eyes narrowing with a hint of memory, maybe something from his own past, something he didn't say out loud. He sat there in silence for a beat too long, then reached into his hoodie pocket. Michael assumed he was searching for a card. Or maybe he was going to offer a few $100 just to be kind, and then walk away like most celebrities do when they try to do a quick good deed. But Ozzy didn't pull out cash. He pulled out a slightly crushed packet of cigarettes and a lighter, then set them down on the bench. "I quit, but I keep them in case I need to remember things," he murmured, like that explained everything. Michael stared at him, confused, waiting for the moment to shift into reality, and that's when Ozzy said something that felt like being punched in the heart. "I know what it's like to think nothing's going to change." Michael didn't know it yet, but something was about to shift that would lead him to question everything he believed about strangers, timing, and destiny. And this was only the beginning. Ozzy pushed the lighter toward him like a ritual. Michael didn't smoke, not anymore, but for some reason he picked up the lighter, feeling the cool metal press against his palm. Ozzy leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his voice low. "Tell me one thing," he said. "Do you actually want to give up?" Michael opened his mouth, then shut it, because he didn't have an honest answer. He wanted to scream yes and no at the same time. Instead, tears rolled again, embarrassingly, uncontrollably, and he just shook his head. Ozzy nodded once, as if that was enough, and reached into his hoodie a second time. This time, he pulled out something different, a folded piece of paper, creased and worn, like he had been carrying it a long time. Michael frowned. "What's that?" Ozzy looked at it like it was something sacred. "Something someone gave me a long time ago," he said. "Something I needed back then." He unfolded it carefully. It was an address, a single name, and under it, a handwritten message Dionaut Hasitai. Ozzy looked Michael directly in the eyes for the first time. "You go here today," he said. "Right now. And tell them I sent you." Michael felt suspicion flicker, confusion mixing with desperation, wondering if this was a prank or some elaborate stunt. But Ozzy's voice carried a certainty that couldn't be faked. And when Michael finally turned the slip over, he saw a hospital logo faintly embossed at the top. A hospital he had never heard of. He stared, clutching the paper, his hands still trembling. "Why a hospital?" he whispered. Ozzy didn't break eye contact. "Because sometimes losing a job ain't the actual problem," he said. "It's what happens after." Michael didn't understand what that meant, not yet. Ozzy stood, stretching his aching knees, and patted Michael on the shoulder. "Go," he repeated. "Before you start thinking too much." Then he did something Michael never expected. He reached into his pocket a third time, pulled out a black Sharpie, and signed the termination paper. He slid it back toward Michael with a tiny grin. "Proof that today wasn't just bad," he said. Something happened. Michael blinked at the autograph. A surreal symbol on the most depressing document he'd ever held. When he looked up again, Ozzy was already walking away, hands tucked into his hoodie, head down as if he knew exactly where he was going, leaving Michael clutching a piece of paper that made no sense but felt strangely important. Michael almost stood and ran after him, but then something strange happened that froze him in place. His phone buzzed. Normally, that would be nothing, but the caller ID made his stomach flip UNKWNBR. He hesitated, then answered. A quiet woman's voice said, "We're expecting you." Michael stared at the slip of paper in his hand. "Expecting me where?" She read the address, the same address Ozzy had written. "Please come today," she said. Before 5, the call disconnected. Michael's heart pounded so hard he could barely think. This made no logical sense. How could they know? Who told them? He looked around the street, but Ozzy was gone, nowhere in sight, swallowed by the city. Michael finally stood, pocketed the address, and started walking. He told himself he was doing it because he had nothing else to lose. But somewhere under the fear, another feeling stirred. A spark of curiosity. Like a match being struck in the dark. He had no idea what awaited him at that address, or why a rock legend would involve himself in the problems of a complete stranger. But he couldn't ignore the voice on the phone. And if Ozzy Osbourne said go, what did he really have to lose? Michael reached the hospital by early afternoon, a squat brick building on a side street in Glendale, almost hidden behind a row of eucalyptus trees. The sign out front was faded, almost forgotten, and the parking lot was strangely empty. He doubted himself with every step toward the entrance, wondering whether he should turn around, whether Ozzy was messing with him, Or maybe Michael's brain was just broken from stress. But when he stepped inside, something eerie happened. The receptionist looked up, smiled like she recognized him, and said, "Mr. Reyes." Right through that door. Michael didn't even have time to ask how she knew his name. He obeyed, pushing through a heavy grey door that led to a dim hallway and the distant sound of machines humming. A man in a white coat appeared, holding a clipboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. He glanced up, saw Michael, and nodded. "You're early," the doctor said. "Ozzy told me you'd come closer to 4. Michael stumbled over his words, unable to form a coherent sentence. "Yo, you know him?" The doctor smiled strangely. "We all know him," he said. "Now follow me. There's something you need to see." What lay beyond that hallway would not only explain why Ozzy sent him there. It would open a door to something buried deep in Michael's past. Something he didn't realize was destroying him piece by piece. And before the next hour ended, he would discover a truth that would make losing his job feel like the least shocking thing that happened that week. The doctor led Michael into a quiet room with no windows, only a desk, 2 chairs, and a folder sitting dead center like it was waiting. "Sit," the doctor said, and when Michael did, he slid the folder across the table. "This belongs to you," he said. Michael opened it hesitantly, and the first thing he saw was his daughter's name. Then his wife's. Then medical paperwork he had never seen before, stamped with dates from 2 years ago, tests he didn't recognize, prescriptions he didn't know existed. Where did this come from? He whispered. The doctor tapped the folder. "Ozzy said to tell you, this is what happens when you don't know what you're really fighting." Michael stared at the test results. Asthma? Yes. But something else too, something circled in red with a word he didn't want to read. The doctor leaned forward. "Your daughter needs treatment," he said softly. "Treatment that was denied by your insurance." Michael's chest tightened. He hadn't seen this paperwork. He didn't know anything had been denied. His wife never told him, or maybe she didn't know either. "You're holding a pile of unanswered questions," the doctor said. "But there's something else." He reached back into a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, thick and heavy. "This," he said, "is a grant fund. No repayment. Anonymous donation. And yes, Ozzy arranged it." Michael shook his head, unable to breathe, because nothing about this seemed real anymore. But the doctor wasn't finished. He put a hand on the folder and said quietly, "You were never supposed to sit on that bench today." Michael felt dizzy. "What do you mean?" The doctor studied his face carefully. "Ozzy only finds people who still have something left to fight for." Michael stared at the envelope, his pulse thundering. Inside was enough money to cover medical care for a year, enough to restart a life, enough to breathe. But the doctor leaned closer and whispered something that sent a chill through Michael's entire body. "He told me you're not the first." The room seemed to shrink around him. "The first what?" Michael whispered. The doctor just smiled faintly. "The first stranger he stepped in for." Michael wanted answers. He wanted to know how a rock legend ended up handing out hope like this. But the doctor looked at the clock on the wall and said, "He said you'd want to find him." Michael didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Find him? Where? Why? But the doctor slid a second piece of paper toward him. A torn, faded photograph of a diner, a handwritten time scrawled in marker 60:10 p.m. Michael recognized the diner instantly. It was his daughter's favorite place. Saturday pancakes. But why that place? Why that time? The doctor stood, patted Michael on the shoulder, and said, "Don't be late." Michael grabbed the folder, the envelope, the photograph, and rushed out of the hospital, adrenaline shaking his limbs. He looked back once before leaving, but the doctor was already gone, door closing slowly behind him. He checked the time. He had 4 hours. And somewhere in those hours, answers waited. Michael spent the next hour driving aimlessly around Glendale, the papers sitting on the passenger seat like dynamite, his head filled with questions he couldn't slow down. Why him? Why today? Why Ozzy Osbourne? He pulled over in a strip mall parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to decide whether to tell his wife everything or pretend like this whole day was some kind of weird hallucination. But before he could think too long, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He answered. There was no voice this time, just a sound, a guitar. A slow, quiet riff, unmistakably Ozzy. Not a song. More like someone playing aimlessly, tuning up. Then a voice whispered, "Don't be late." The call ended. Michael stared at his phone, heart pounding, then started the car. By 6:00 p.m., he approached the diner from the photo. The neon sign flickered, the windows fogged from steam, and inside, families and grandparents and lone teenagers stared at menus printed 20 years ago. But at one booth, in the far back corner, sat a figure wearing a plain black baseball cap, hood up, staring out the window like he was waiting for someone. Michael felt his legs shake again. That was Ozzy. He walked inside, stomach twisting, and slid into the booth. Ozzy didn't speak at first. He just looked at Michael, then nodded once. Like everything was going exactly how it needed to. Finally Ozzy leaned forward, voice low and steady. "There's one more thing," he said. Michael braced himself. He didn't know if he could handle one more twist today. But Ozzy didn't give him a choice. "You lost your job today because you weren't supposed to stay there," he said. "They were going to cut your hours. They were going to deny your insurance again. And you were going to lose something much worse." Michael stared at him, confused and scared. "Lose what?" Ozzy looked down at the table, then back up. "Your daughter's breath." The words hit harder than anything yet. "How do you know any of this?" Michael whispered. Ozzy just tapped his chest. "Because someone did it for me once." Michael's breath caught. "Someone helped you?" Ozzy nodded. "When I was at my lowest. When I couldn't see past tomorrow." He looked out the window again. "Look, life's not about money, mate. Or jobs. Or pride. It's about moments when someone sees you drowning and throws you a rope." Michael swallowed, eyes burning, unable to speak. Ozzy reached into his hoodie one last time, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, and slid it across the table. Michael unfolded it slowly. It was a job offer. Not a generic one, not something random, but a real offer from a community outreach program at a hospital, helping families navigate insurance denials, something meaningful, something that made sense. Michael stared. "Why me?" Ozzy smiled, tired but genuine. "Because you know how it feels. And that means you'll know how to help them." Michael didn't realize he was crying again, until Ozzy slid a napkin across the table. They sat in silence for a long moment, two men who shouldn't have crossed paths but did. And then Ozzy stood up, placed cash on the table for Michael's dinner before he could protest, and said two final things. First, tell your daughter to order extra pancakes. And second, when you see someone sitting alone, looking defeated, don't walk past. Then, just like earlier, Ozzy slipped out the door and vanished into the evening, swallowed by the city once more. Michael sat there staring at the empty booth, realizing his life had flipped in a single day, a single encounter, a single decision to accept help when he least expected it. And weeks later, when Michael started his first day at the new job, helping families like his own, he kept one thing in his desk drawer, a manila folder with a Sharpie signature scrawled across the top. Because every time he opened that drawer, he remembered something Ozzy Osbourne once whispered on a grey day when everything felt lost. You weren't meant to give up. And maybe, just maybe, someone else needed him to show up exactly the same way.